Ms. Ernst, Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. I have you. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. I have you. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Capito, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 45, and the nomination is confirmed. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that with respect to the Lutnick nomination, the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 13, S-Con Res 7.
The question occurs on the motion to proceed. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Thank you. She did. Thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. I got you, Capito. Yeah, okay. I got you. I like your jacket. Thank you. Thank you.
We're getting you a copy of it to take since you're
Okay. You're welcome, of course, Mr. Durbin. Yeah, I got him. I know. I got you, Senator. I did.
Thanks,
Thank you. I saw you. Thank you. I did. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. I did get you. Thank you. Senator Paul. I got you. I got you. No?
got me, no.
Okay. Shaheen, I got you. Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you. I did. Thank you. I'll get you. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, thank you. I do. Thank you. I did get her. Hold on a second. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
This is waiting back there.
I know, but everybody has to wait.
No, not yet.
Oh, earrings and the necklace, I didn't see that before.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Ernst. No. Thank you, sir. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. It's the third one, yeah. Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice. Perfect timing. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you. I got you. Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thank you. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moreno, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mrs. Moody, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Lee, aye. Thank you. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye.
Falcon 9. Great call out there for landing burn startup.
Stage 2 is in terminal guidance.
Ms. Hassan, no.
Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Markowski. Ms. Markowski, aye.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 47, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the concurrent resolution.
Calendar number 13, S-Con Res 7, concurrent resolution setting forth the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2025, and so forth.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky, from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with me today is my colleague from my office, Mr. John Lowry, and I appreciate his help. Last week, Mr. President, I spoke a few minutes about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We call it CPB. And the Public Broadcasting Service, most people know of that as PBS. And the National Public Radio, which most people know as NPR. And I'm not going to repeat everything I said last week, but I do want to revise and extend my remarks. The United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting back in the 60s, 1967, I think. Those were very different times. There was no internet. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no cable TV. There were no podcasts. There were basically a handful, maybe a few more, of radio stations throughout America. And television was still pretty new. There were 3 main television stations with local affiliates. And many Americans, particularly in rural areas, didn't have access to radio and television for their news, because that's all there was. I remember those days. And so Congress decided to start providing money for what it called at that time public broadcasting, to make sure that everybody had access to news through radio and television, even if they didn't live in their big city. And Congress intended that news be news, factually based. Now, those were the days in America of true journalism. I remember them. Perhaps you do too, Mr. President. Those were not the days that we experience today, opinion journalism, where young journalists are taught to report on who, what, when, where, how, and their opinion. Those were days when the news was really the news, and it was fair and balanced. So the United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPS. CPS here 50 years later, 50 plus years later, or CPB rather, still exists. And here's its relationship, CPB's relationship to NPR and PBS. We give CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, about $500 million a year. A lot of money. And Corporation for Public Broadcasting turns around and picks certain local television and radio stations and gives most of that money to them And then those local television and radio stations, the chosen few that get money from the American taxpayer through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, buy programming and content from two other organizations. If they're a radio station, they buy it from NPR. And if they're a television station, they buy that content from PBS. So up here you've got Corporation for Public Broadcasting. American taxpayer through Congress gives them $500 million a year. That money flows down to certain select local television and radio stations. And those local television and radio stations then buy content from NPR, if they're a radio station, or PBS, if they're a TV station, which were loosely affiliated with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Since this scheme was established, the American taxpayer has given all of these entities about, $14.5 billion. $14.5 billion. That would be enough to build 2,700 miles of paved roads throughout America. And I base that on the roads I'm talking about are not gravel roads, they're regular paved roads, 10 feet each lane, actually 12 feet each lane with a 3-foot shoulder on each side. But instead of building 2,700 miles of roads in our rural areas and in our urban areas that need infrastructure, we've decided to give this money to CPB, which gives it to the local stations, which gives it to PBS and NPR. I mentioned the local stations. Only a select few local stations get this taxpayer money. In my state, we have over 500 radio stations. Corporation for Public Broadcasting, in its unfettered discretion, only picks 7 to give the money to. The other 493 get nothing. We have over 150 TV stations in Louisiana. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting only gives the taxpayer money to 3 of them. So 147 get nothing. Now, I probably wouldn't object to this if the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and National Public Radio is what I'm referring to, of course, and PBS had been consistent with its original mission, which is to report factually the news to the American people. Government doesn't need to subsidize the media anymore because the world's changed. 97% of the people in America have the internet. But I still probably wouldn't object that much if the reporting by these entities was fair and was balanced, but it is not. No fair-minded person in America can look at this programming and believe that it's unbiased. It is decidedly prejudiced in favor of one point of view. That's not just my opinion. I think most Americans would agree with that. And because most Americans see the headlines that are produced by these 3 entities. I talked about some last week. This is what Americans' taxpayer money is going to do, to provide. Here's just some headlines from NPR. I mentioned these last week. I won't belabor them. Michael Avenatti, a profile of the media-savvy attorney. NPR, this is from NPR. They loved Michael Avenatti, who, of course, is in jail today. He's a crook. But NPR loved him because he was anti-Republican and he was anti-President Trump. NPR published another article, How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music. Now, you don't have to be Euclid to see the implication here, that country music is racist, according to NPR. I don't think any fair-minded person would call that factual or fair and balanced. Here's another headline from NPR. Donald Trump's long embrace of Vladimir Putin. I also talked last week about a few other headlines from NPR. Here's one. Monuments and teams have changed names as America reckons with racism. Birds are next. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Eating less beef is a climate solution. Here's why that's hard for some American men. How the Taliban adds to Afghanistan's woes when it comes to climate-fueled disasters. No fair-minded person with an IQ above a single-cell organism would conclude that this is anything but biased to certain points of view. And there's more. I could do this all night, but I'm not. Here's some more headlines from NPR. There is no neutral. Nice white people can still be complicit in a racist society. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Another one. Ibram X. Kendi says no one is not racist. So what should we do? Another one. How artificial intelligence could perpetuate racism, sexism, and other biases in society. Another. Scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Here's another one. As Trump pushes theory of virus origins, some see parallels to lead up to Iraq war. Your tax dollars at work. As U.S. confronts Russia, Trump's admiration of Putin is consistent. Another headline from NPR. The history of policing and race in the United States are deeply intertwined. Another. After Biden's debate performance, the presidential race is unchanged. This was the debate performance that President Biden gave, after which he got out of the race. If you believe that headline, you believe in the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes. But that's what NPR reported with your tax dollars. Here's more. Democracy on Trial, Part 1. A blueprint for the case against Trump. Is that fair and balanced? It's from PBS. Racism in the era of Trump, an oral history, another headline. January 13th, 2020. Another.